All right, welcome, Richard. Great to have you. Love to hear about your background, some of your journey, and obviously get into what NYIAX is doing.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you for having me. It's a pleasure to be here and share my journey and the NYIAX journey, which has been a fun 3 years for me here. So I actually started out my career working, building very early websites before there was a lot of the tools that existed. Actually, I'm forgetting a part, which was the very first part of that of my first consulting gig was working for Citibank, writing risk administration systems back when DOS was still around. It was being phased out, and actually the project that was phasing onto Windows was a 32 person team building the same thing that two of us were supporting in DOS. So it wasn't necessarily a super efficient thing, but so my early experience was shipping software on disks all around the world, right? So we had 38 different countries that were using the software, and we were supporting it and installing it, doing the full end-to-end. It was quite a fun experience for me for my first consulting gig, and that transitioned pretty quickly into building websites and a lot of the early CSS and HTML style coding that was all done pretty much in hand back then. And that transitioned pretty quickly from building the websites into the commercial side of it, right, which is where I've pretty much stayed throughout the whole rest of my career. So back, one of my first roles back in the day was to build the website, but make sure that the commercial aspect of the website, and particularly computerweekly.com in the UK and a New Scientist for the Reed business that's based out of UK. And so I had a lot of very early experience with commercializing the web. This was around 2000, and we all know what happened then. There was a bubble that burst, and at that time, what the consolidation meant was that a lot of the websites that could actually survive and had a proper commercial model really did survive. And I was for a long time in the publishing division, and at that point, there were a few companies that emerged which were handling the advertising technology for large organizations. So basically taking the commercials that you see or the advertising space that sellers like big publishing houses or anybody who has consumers coming to their website and funding it with advertising. So that was the early stage, and that was everything from trafficking the ads to designing the custom microsites, as they were called back then, which are just essentially little branded areas of the web that both brands and publishers were putting together. So that led into, at the time, there was a number of companies that did that. One of the most famous ones was DoubleClick, which was acquired by Google, and now is really what powers the majority of the advertising ecosystem. And I was working for a smaller company, which was called AdTech. And that company was actually founded in Germany. So I worked for them for 8 years. Ultimately was acquired by AOL. And what I did for them was multiple things. I literally grew up through the whole customer life cycle, right away, customer support through to customer engineering, start projects, and ultimately into product and business development. And I left the AdTech AOL organization back in, I guess it was 13, and I moved over to a company, and so I should just say that time it was very much, it was a relatively simple ecosystem at that point, because there was really buyers and sellers, and there was a few technology players in the middle who were supporting the buyers and sellers, and that grew up pretty fast around real-time bidding. And I joined a company called IP on Web. At that time, they had been very much behind the scenes, building a lot of the real-time infrastructure. So that infrastructure is, when everyone transits the web, there's multiple calls being made, of course, to various content and videos and the HTML itself and the text and everything that makes up the web. And at that time, a portion of the industry had discovered that it was you could use financial model, if you like, an auction model, to reach out to multiple buyers and sellers in the less than 100 milliseconds in order to decide and deliver the right advertising to consumer as they were transiting the web, and that was the kind of next phase of the evolution of the industry, which ultimately ended up being now what we call what's called programmatic or real-time RTB.
Isn't that's powering a pretty large majority of the web advertising traffic, isn't it?
It's surpassed. It's certainly on an impression basis. It's surpassed the direct part of the business, and it's got some benefits, right? So that because you can use machines to decide. You can use machines to decide what advertising goes to the individual based on signals that you're receiving, based on preferences that consumers have, based on various other signals that come via those systems. So that's a big part of the industry now, and although it's still not overtaken the monetary side of the equation, certainly the impressions, the number of impressions that are processed on a daily basis is much higher in the real-time ecosystem than in the direct ecosystem. And because it's impossible for humans to really make those decisions, right? Because it's all happening so quickly, right, in less than 100 milliseconds. So, so I spent a number of years at the company called upfront. Actually, most interesting part of that job was that I was managing a team across in Japan. I was managing a team out of Tokyo, where our big partner DAC, Digital Advertising Consortium, which is a consortium including Yahoo and Nikkei and a few other big players over there. We were building and deploying real-time systems for them, as well as other companies in Europe and US. And my team was across 5 markets, interestingly doing various different parts of the build and deployment of the technology we were building. So the Japanese folks were responsible for kind of quality and ultimately we were handing over the UI and back into them. So that was a really interesting time, working with different cultures and working with different parts of the world on a single project, so I was there for 3.5 years, 4 years. And the other interesting thing about that time, which I think could be relevant, was that we were in the process of deploying a new style of business model, right? Before IPM Web had been very much custom work for hire, right? Or the thought about building software in a way which was very bespoke, right? And I spent a lot of time thinking about how we productize the underlying architecture that we had that had been deployed across more than 100 companies over the time that they'd been in market. So that was an interesting challenge. And I ultimately launched a product, and a number of customers so you probably heard of probably not heard of a company called Automatic, but ultimately they deploy software called WordPress, which I'm sure you have heard of, and the Word Ads program inside WordPress was actually powered by the technology we built, as well as some other companies like Dish and most of the companies IPM Web services are not allowed to talk about because they're very much powering behind the scenes, and the companies that are working with IPM Web like to keep that to themselves.
So you used the word bespoke earlier, which basically, for people who don't know, it just basically means custom build, right? And so right. You were basically looking across, it sounded like over 100 projects to try to figure out what was a common framework that you could build.
That's right. So the underlying framework was things like ETL. There was obviously HTTP. So it processed the incoming requests and responded to them. There was an analytics tool which sat on top of all of the data, so you could interrogate it. There was couple of optimization models or optimization systems that could be deployed using various different algorithms to decide what ad goes to who and when. Mm-hmm. And all those things basically came together in different product forms, right? So my job was to bring those, for instance, those in a certain configuration to a publisher, or those in a certain configuration to WordPress. Mm-hmm. That's what I mean by. So before that, it was very much just design it together, right? So that was my time at IPONWeb, and then by that point I was general manager and I'd kind of done all of the jobs. So I got a little bit more, got a sense of what all the jobs were, and I moved over to NYIAX in 3 years ago now. So and at that point I went over to NYIAX as the chief product officer and was very excited about it, partly because of the Nasdaq partnership, which I can talk a little bit more about, but because we kind of got a chance to redesign, if you like, the way that advertising was done after 10, 15 years. And at the time, we also got a chance to lean into using blockchain with Nasdaq, and we have actually have a very strong relationship with Nasdaq because we helped them deploy in the cloud, which was new for them. And I've since then become president for the company, and we've gone through our kind of early development, getting our first customers, and we're at the point where we're growing. And it's really just a matter of kind of making sure the supply and demand inside the NYIAX model really works very well, and then continuing to evolve the product in line with our customers' needs. So that's where we are today, and that's where I also co-chair the blockchain working group inside the IAB, which has always been part of the IAB. I've always been active inside the Internet Advertising Bureau. But this last 2.5 years, I've had a chance to co-chair a working group of over 300 people. There's about 80 companies who are participating on a regular basis. So that's been an interesting step.
Which is that, the blockchain working group or a different one?
Blockchain working group, yeah.
Okay. How is that going? I knew I did some work with the ad chain guys in their early days.
Yeah.
Are they still participating?
I don't believe the ad chain folks are still participating. There's a kind of mix of folks who are participating right now. There's a few member companies who are kind of leading the conversations. My co-chair is Michael Palmer, who is head of new technologies for WPP, which is one of the largest, if not the largest, holding company agency group in the world. So
are you all familiar with WPP? I figured you were, Victoria. It's basically a group that has both grown organically as well as through acquisitions of smaller digital agencies into, as Richard said, one of the largest, essentially, holding company agencies in the world. So they specialize in everything, basically, right?
Yeah, so they have a number of agencies that do creative work, they do buying, they do planning, they do everything that an advertiser is typically focused on the advertiser side, so the folks that are spending the money, essentially, and they do everything pretty much. I mean, they have different structures across the different world for different. Can be quite complicated to try and work out exactly what parts do what. Sometimes they don't even know because it's such a big organization. Yeah, so that leads us to NYIAX, where I am now, obviously, and I'd love to share a little bit about what we're doing there. But I can also, I think the different. Before I do that, I just think I'll just kind of categorize a couple of things here. That the first company I was working for, EdTech, was very much a product out of the box. Had been around for 10, 15 years. Right, so it was well used in various areas. It was really the whole process of bringing that company to market, because I did that for the US, was all about kind of growth of the base, right? And it was an interesting challenge, multiculturally an interesting challenge. The feature sets, while you think they might be similar, in some cases the differences between the way the UK operates and the way the US operates is quite significant, enough to actually need a different product in some cases. I think that's an important point to make. And I as I moved to IPONWeb, that was even more pronounced, right? Because often this was not an off-the-shelf product, right? This was you had to understand the business problem, right? You really had to make sure that you weren't just taking something you did before and reusing it because there was IP problems back then, because a lot of the companies that we were working with needed to retain their IP. So we had to build a level of trust in order to make sure that we weren't sharing that between companies. And then NYIAX is a slightly different model in the sense that we've licensed and all partnered with a financial technology, which is obviously well worn and well understood inside the financial markets, and we've adapted it for media and advertising. So I think those are three very different ways to approach a similar problem, right? So the problem doesn't change really. It's about the problem that advertising is trying to solve for is to get a message in front of the consumer so that we can sell products. And there's three very distinct ways that I've been involved in doing that. And each one brings its own set of challenges. Particularly I'll talk more about the NYIAX one. I mean, we adapted under our design the Nasdaq system at its core. It's actually led to a joint patent around. So it's a interesting. I can't go too much into that today, but I think the core differences between the way Nasdaq trades and the way that advertising trades is that there's a very large number of things that descriptors of the thing you're trading, right? So in the stock market, it's five-letter symbology, and then price, volume, time. In advertising, as you are probably aware, there are multiple things that are being traded. There are, of course, price, volume, and time, but there's also a very complex view of the types of behaviors people might have, the geographical locations, and everything else that goes into media and advertising. Just even the formats is obviously wildly different, and the economics that sit around each one of those things are also a thing that gets traded. So, that dovetails, and I can share maybe share this presentation just to give you a bit of a backdrop.
Yeah, that'd be great. So yeah, I never actually thought about that. So you're saying because there's so many attributes for targeting, it creates this huge number of basically a huge data set that you're bidding on, right? And trading, which is vastly more complicated than a stock trade.
That's right.
That's interesting.
And yeah, and that's the core differentiator. So that's, if you look at what's happened in the real-time world, right? That's all being solved at less than 100 milliseconds, in less than 100 milliseconds by the machines. Mm-hmm. And what the core thesis of NYIAX is that there's still a large portion of the market that doesn't have the financially rigorous processes enough for people to trust putting these large deals, these forward, as we call them, upfront deals, that essentially are somebody buying space in the future. Mm-hmm. So there wasn't really the technology to do that in the past, and there just frankly wasn't even the trust to do that, right? Because these are big deals. Often people want to do those very large deals in a direct way. They want to be able to communicate with the people they're doing that with. So NYIAX is really actually York. It's got
sorry, I think I need to make you a co-host. That's a default now because of the Zoom bombing episodes.
Yeah.
Sorry about that. Let's see. All right, you're a co-host. You should be able to present.
Let's share this. You can all see yourselves for a moment. On that.
That's good. Yeah, we can see it.
Got it. All right, so let's. There we go. Just let me know if you can see it. Okay.
Yep. Perfect.
All right. So just the basics are NYIAX is a marketplace for discovering, managing, and reconciling media contracts, and it's an important distinction that it's the contract that we're trading. Right. So in the real-time market, where there's impressions are being traded, so it's happening on an impression by impression basis. Mm-hmm. That means the individual transiting the web creates an impression. That's an impression by impression basis. In our world, it's more of a bulk buy. You're buying something in the future. So you're buying a space in the future that, and that's the contract is really the focus we have. So all of the terms and everything that goes around contract management, we cater for. Right, and that's partly we do that because there really wasn't this this capability to aggregate in that way in a standard mechanism, right? So I've talked a little bit about the history and the other points on this slide, but we realized that partnering with Nasdaq was important for a number of reasons. One was because the trust that's involved, with the trust that's needed in our industry as relates to handling an increased amount of trading inside the industry, and with a part of the industry that is yet to be automated. If you look at the numbers, basically there's the majority of deals that are non-real time are still done using emails, using essentially paper contracts that often get sent around by PDF. And the kind of systematizing of that process, the contract management workflow, the standardization of the language that's used to do that trade, and ultimately allowing buyers and sellers to directly do that so that they get transparency into what the fees are and everything else were critical things for us in that partnership. And particularly use of blockchain was important because it allows us to, while it's not a full public blockchain, it's certainly the benefits you get from a single place to store the information about what you've traded and the results of the delivery against that trade. It was just table stakes for us to be involved. And we'll talk a little bit later on about why.
Let me just ask, a quick question for the class here. Where in the advertising, the thing that you're automating in the advertising process, is it setup of insertion orders? Is it traffic buying? Where does it sort of fit?
So it fits. So the process that we go through, that our customers go through, is there's both buyers and sellers, so advertisers and publishers, or media owners. So media owners go through a process with us of onboarding their inventory onto the exchange, right? And that looks like a storefront to start, and then there's obviously opportunistic and kind of tentpole style quarter by quarter listings of the inventory space they have, right? That's on the sell side, and then on the buy side,
and that inventory could be any type of media asset.
Yeah, we focus on digital to start, and that includes.
I mean, any kind of digital media asset. Yeah,
but it could be any media asset. I mean, technically speaking, anything anything you can describe using the same language could be put on. And we've yet to take it to linear video, but that's obviously a candidate for this. And audio is on the list, as well as digital out of home. So just it actually to us doesn't matter so much because we're focused on the contract. What we're doing is we're bringing the contract details onto an exchange so that buyers and sellers can trade. So, and then what buyers do is they can do the same, right? So this is actually a true marketplace in the sense that it's not just an auction house, which is what a lot of the RTB systems are today. It's a buyer can list and a seller can list. So a seller can look and see what buyer's been listing and actually put an order request against that, what they're looking for, and then they negotiate. Or a buyer can reach out to a seller and say, we would like this kind of space. We see that you typically sell these kind of audiences, or you typically sell this kind of sporting event. Let's do a deal. So it's a two-sided market in that sense. And the things you were discussing earlier. So the benefits we're really creating is that streamline of the process, right? It's absolutely critical to have standards in this ecosystem.
Yep.
And we also added benefit of the kind of approach we've taken with the partnership with Nasdaq is that you have very clear governing rules of the exchange, which have been a real problem for media and advertising particularly the last 7 years, because a lot of nefarious activity being hidden in that individual by impression transaction, right? It's very difficult to scrutinize every single impression, right? What we're doing here is we're bringing those rules. So there's a standard set of rules on the exchange, and then there's an individual governing set of rules per contract that both parties are agreeing to, right? And that is a critical part that we felt was missing in the industry. And this is actually a lot where the advertisers and agencies are leaving in right now, because they want that upfront. They want to understand that upfront. They don't just want to have to deal with that as a problem at the end, which is really how it's been dealt with in the last 10 years.
Right.
And then I mentioned before that we're using, today we're gathering all of the terms and everything that goes into the contract. Smart contracts for us mean two things, right? Smart contracts is a technical term that is obviously a language inside distributed ledger technology, but we also think about it as what can you translate from the legal language. And Carolina, I believe you were involved in this too. Carolina was involved in the smart legal contracts definition as part of the Digital Chamber of Commerce.
Yes.
And so that's the core benefits that we have inside NYIAX. Our implementation at the start, so this is back to a little bit the journey. We started off by using chain.com for the implementation of blockchain, and we had two opportunities to work with it. And the first one, which was presented to us, was really to help Nasdaq modularize the system overall, the Nasdaq financial framework, as part of that, creating a connector that connected to chain.com, right? So there was essentially a language which, connected it to chain.com. And that, originally gave us the idea that we wanted to be capable of implementing with multiple chain providers. We always saw that there was never going to be just one chain provider, mostly because we see different use cases. So we did chain.com first, and then we actually subsequently moved over to Hyperledger. And we now use Hyperledger today. It's our own, our team is not engaged with IBM at all on that. It's all been developed in-house. And we particularly liked it because of the permissionable, the capabilities it has around permissions, and frankly, the rest of the industry was also leaning, certainly I shouldn't say the industry, I would say the people we were engaged with at the time were very much leaning into that technology. So that was part of the decision point for us.
Is there any benefit, you mentioned here a standardized taxonomy. There's actually a fairly sizable effort going on now in the blockchain space about creating essentially token taxonomies for different types of business object assets. So there's a token taxonomy initiative basically that's cross-ledger. So it's trying to get the sort of extract the business definition above the ledger implementation nuances to try to basically help with sort of cross-chain interoperability.
Yeah, I think that's one way to go at this. So we've always we're certainly very much aware of that capability, mostly through the working group. And I think there's actually some number of proposals for engaging in that space on the IAB level, because that's the body for standards inside the advertising industry. The way we think about this is slightly different, and it comes to, I think, a really important point that actually is something that I've seen throughout my whole career, which I think might be helpful for everyone here, is that we see that the money flow is often a big driver for adoption. The technical standards, the technical approach often is very important. Don't get me wrong. I spend a lot of time developing technology, and I think that's an important part of. But actually, getting adoption is often a bigger challenge. And sometimes just focusing on getting the early adopters to spend money in one way or another also gets a lot of traction. And so the way we think about the reason why we are a marketplace, and the reason why we focused on buyers and sellers so much right now is because we believe that the standards in the exchange should come first, so you can build trust, and then the use of technology should come second, right? So I think while the token initiative makes a huge amount of sense, and we're absolutely paying attention to it right now. Right at the stage of the business we're in right now, we're making sure that our clients the ones who are spending money with us, are you know, are getting what they need. And I think that's so I think the standards on the exchange, being able to talk each other the same language, and then working out how we're going to interoperate with multiple providers downstream is really what we're focused on. So
yeah, I mean that makes a ton of sense. Yeah, and I think it's also a very good point about establishing any new business, right? It's, don't get too hung up on the technology, because the technology is not the business, right? It's a tool to serve the needs of the business.
Right. Yeah, I think I think that's a good way of putting it. So let's just, I think I just want to, like, I don't necessarily want to focus on this for a huge amount of time, but I think it's just important to kind of visualize a little bit like how we think about
Yeah, totally agree. This is great.
Process, right? So we've got the agencies. I don't know which side you are, but anyway, you've got the agencies on one side, and then
left side.
I think turned the mirroring off on this thing. So yeah. Anyway, so we've got the folks who spend the money on the left, and we've got folks who receive the money on the right. And what we've done here is we've focused, using Nasdaq, our own, and blockchain technology. We focused on the contract management, and particularly compliance is really the piece that resonates most with the current industry. And we've created those standard taxonomies and the business terms through the rules of exchange, like I mentioned earlier. And then frankly, we took the standards from the IAB and created a standard taxonomy between the buyer and the seller. And then a whole suite of campaign media planning tools which are required in order to actually plan and spend the money. And then ultimately we end up with media trading. And that's the bit that really connects to Nasdaq, right? So all of the stuff around the edge is really stuff we built ourselves, right? It's stuff that we needed to, the advertising specific use case, which I should point out is the first use case of potentially many that NYIAX has. Because this system has been built in a way which it doesn't necessarily have to just have advertising taxonomies. It could have other asset taxonomies.
That's a great point.
Yeah, and we deliberately built that way, although obviously we have to, there's trade-offs always when you're building technology. You can't make it super flexible all the time because you end up creating problems for yourself elsewhere. But the current CTO, Sergey, and the teams have always had in mind that this is something that can be extensible to other markets. And particularly when you look at the things we've built around the edges, they're very relevant for other markets. So, you know, understanding whether something's been delivered or not is not necessarily something that happens in the stock market as detailed a way as you might for other use cases. So if you so having these capabilities was quite helpful. And then what you see on the second part is really after the trade has been effectuated, you essentially end up with what would be normally a piece of paper that's got two signatures on it is now it's been stored in the NYIAX system, and it's also being written to Nasdaq. There's a bunch of things we do there around, you know, making instruments and securities, which are very, you know, financially orientated steps in the process. But essentially what they're doing is recording and allowing us to connect with a regulated exchange in a way. Should there be regulation in that kind of form inside the media and advertising market, we'll be, you know, ahead of the game with that step. And the last part is all about,
that's in the bottom on the data compliance area. Right.
So the data compliance and programmatic delivery is twofold, right? So it's in order to so once you've created the contract between two parties, you're agreeing to pay once you have delivered, right? And there's a single source of record, or it could be multiple sources of record. Today it's mostly single, but the idea is that we will ingest from either real time or directly from the ad delivery systems, depending on what the two parties have agreed. ingest the delivery source, and we have our own version of that too, although we're not trying to reinvent the wheel around that. We're just trying to interface with the current market. And that whole process triggers essentially the checking, the compliance, the data compliance, actual checking whether delivery happened, reporting back to the buyers and sellers on what happened. And you see there that we've got connectivity with a demand side platform, which is DSP, or with Google DFP, which is the largest ad delivery system for publishers. And then any supply side platforms that are all, so the DSPs and the SSPs are obviously real-time systems. And DFP is more of the primary ad delivery system for a publisher. And then in the center, we've actually done some partnerships, and we'll continue to do partnerships in this particular area. And that's another point I wanted to make about whether you build yourself or partner, right? You often make that decision. I've made that decision, or made that decision multiple times over the years. And there's, for us, it was a very early decision not to build delivery systems because, first of all, and I'll be really frank about this, we didn't frankly see ourselves as competitive part of the market, right? We're providing a whole set of capabilities that just don't exist in the market today. And it was really important to differentiate. So we did that by just not doing that part of the system and then partnering with companies that do, which is an important consideration, I think. And but we still maintain the ability for us to do that ourselves should we need to. We need to make sure that we needed to make sure that the core functionality could be achieved even if the partner wasn't available or wasn't there. So that's why we have the campaign media planning as an example. We needed to have some level of campaign media planning in order for people to spend money. So that's the core platform. And then, there's some, I find to share this, and it's just some more detailed on the various other system, but I've already walked you through it. So, and just a quick kind of give you full context of who's engaged, right? So along the top of the agencies that we're active with, there's more, but this is a fairly old deck, but Interpublic Group being number 3-ish. I think they kind of go up and down in the rankings. And Interpublic Group, IPG, has an agency, and has an agency called Orion, and an agency called Initiative. And the brands that they service are just underneath that. So BMW, Johnson & Johnson. So these are the folks that are, obviously spending money. And then towards the bottom, you start to see some of the seller brands or the publishers that we've signed and we're engaged with. So you can see very much what we're doing at NYIAX is focused on the folks that have direct sales teams, right? The ones who are doing big deals over multiple months. And it's not the mid to long tail, if you like, or the mom and pop shops. It's really the big brands, because these are the ones that need to have software to manage media in bulk, right, and at large volumes, and they need a trusted system for that. And so we're differentiated in that sense. So I think the next couple of slides are very detailed in what we see as potential automation steps that could happen beyond that. But maybe we can, before I jump into that, maybe I'll pause and see if there's any more questions you have, York, or anything more we want to go back to.
Let's give a moment to see if anyone has any burning questions. And also feel free to use the chat if people don't want to interrupt. This looks like an exciting section, so let's plow forward.
Yeah, we can go for it. I just need to get rid of my picture because I'm looking at myself on the screen here. So I think the preparation we've done with setting the market up in the way we have, and it is all leading to essentially a fully automated supply chain, not delivery, I want to just be clear here that there's two things that are happening in the media and advertising space, right? So for the last 10 years, some people say longer, some people say less, there's really been, the real-time market has really automated the decision at runtime of what ad to deliver to what consumer. Mm-hmm. Obviously data is a component of that, and then the actual machines that, you know, call each other and feed information.
And that's what you would call delivery.
That's what I call delivery.
Yeah.
A lot of steps that people forget, right, that happen around that. Yeah. To get a buyer and seller to agree to trade with each other, or to you know, to trust each other and do business. So, and so we think about the latter more than the former, right? And what we've realized is a little bit focused on blockchain, but I think it's more important to focus on this from just a general business practice perspective, right? So we've been preparing to bring all of the deal terms, all of the providers, everyone involved in the transaction into NYIAX in some capacity. Mm-hmm. Right? Obviously the brands and the agency and the publisher obviously first, but the information about delivery and the connectivity with delivery is also an important step that we're doing too. And where we see this going is that the deal terms and the workflows around how you get paid once delivery has happened are all being recorded in NYIAX, and ultimately we can fully automate the point from trade through to delivery and payment but there's a challenge there, because there's a lot of systems and processes that exist outside of the system, right? So the way we see this is we've got to think about, and I think this is a little bit back to your point, York, on the token exchange part. We see a number of participants obviously inside the value chain, and we have a little bit of a I didn't talk about this much, but there's a part of the industry which essentially is providing capital upfront to publishers in order to buy space, and you know those typically would be called credit facilitators. It's not outside the media and advertising landscape, but they are in the financial markets. Obviously, there's the sellers and suppliers. There's value-added services around that. There's the quality control vendors, which are basically verification services or ad fraud folks that are checking for levels of fraud, levels of viewability, so on and so forth. And then there's the shipping vendors. Obviously, is a very specific use case, but if you think about the shipping vendor inside an advertising context, that is the delivery systems right there. And then, you know, outside of this, there's no customs, there's no regulators really inside the media and advertising space. But these are all steps in the value chain that are required. And you know, the first point I'll make is that the lack of standards is challenging. Now, the good thing about the way we're approaching this is that we enforce standards from day one, right? So you both have to be to the standards of the language that you're trading against. You have to agree to the standards on the exchange, and obviously you are then agreeing in the contract to standards with your counterparty. So, so we also are providing a bunch of capability around this idea that you can trade one-to-one. Well, typically it was a one-to-one relationship, which obviously is very difficult to scale. And what we provide on the exchange is this idea of one-to-many and potentially even bilateral contracts, right? So I didn't mention it before, but as a buyer, you can buy from multiple publishers. And as a seller, you can sell to multiple buyers. Today, typically those contracts are, you know, think about quite a nightmare to send out a standard contract to multiple buyers or multiple sellers, because each one has to be negotiated separately. So the system is designed to help with that, right?
Mm-hmm.
There's obviously some downstream complexities with that. There's a challenge with just everyone has their own workflow, right? There's some risk in changing and changing the workflow of businesses, and so I think what that leads to is the realization that you need to provide a kind of a path to on-ramp is at various different stages into an ecosystem like this, right? And I think that's where forgive me, it's not moving. That's where this is how we kind of think about the stages and the interoperability, right? So we think about you're required. So you see the first part we've already got in place, right? We think about needing to have a weight taxonomy, a common data dictionary, and a standard common contract clauses, which are all the things we have inside the system today. We also think about we actually onboard, so we walk people through that process, right? So it's not something that you have to do by yourself. And then the second step is filtering and matching and all the things that are related to connecting with folks that ultimately are trading right way through, from matching using the standard taxonomy to the trading, the discovery, the trading, and the actual creation of the contract. And this is where I'm trying to make the important point that you need to be able to provide multiple ways to do that, right? We can't just assume that everyone's going to want to use our UI. Because the reality is most companies have their own systems internally. So you need to provide a way to do that, either through people, which we provide a managed service as it happens today to do that, through the UI so they can do it for themselves, which is obviously helps with scaling, and then the API, which ultimately allows programmable interface to do that from current systems. And that applies to the workflow steps that a human actually would take for buying, as well as the downstream verification connectivity, as well as the actual verification.
This is so you're basically saying there's essentially a SaaS user interface, but also an API.
That's right.
Okay.
It's important. Sorry, go on.
There's also a couple questions that we should address in the chat before we get too far. But one of the other questions I had was in the solution that you've developed, it's obviously it's a private permission blockchain. It doesn't sound like it's distributed. Is that an accurate statement?
Yes, not today. Today it's not distributed at all. So it's distributed in the sense that it's has the capability to be distributed. But today there are no other operators of the nodes, and that at this point, frankly, is more of a signal from the focus we have on bringing the money than the ability to deploy it.
Right.
So the value people see in this today is more in the standards and more in some other areas.
You're implementing a new business process in a standard way. Well, you're implementing an existing process, but doing it in a standard way with a value proposition of having essentially a common framework and being a market maker.
Absolutely right, York. Yeah, thank you. Yeah. That's the primary focus. So I don't want to downplay the work we've done in order to get what we've done on our own nodes. The reality is none of our customers at this point are ready or want to do that themselves.
Right.
we do have some projects going on with inside the group, inside the IAB working group, where we're contributing, to things like, this is an important part of this slide as well, contributing to the deployment inside a private permission blockchain across multiple multiple corporate environments, right? Because that's challenging itself, which you kind of forget, right? It'd be great if it was a public network, because you just let people go off and maintain it, but you can't do that, right? So what you have to do is you have to be able to deploy that infrastructure inside other, or be ready to support the deployment of infrastructure inside other people's environments, other corporates' environments, which have a whole different set of rules. I mean, you probably know this better than anybody, honestly, given where you are.
Like the bread and butter of cloud business, right?
Yeah.
So let's take a couple of these questions. There was a question about the payment between the publishers and the advertisers.
Hold on, let me just get them up.
It's in the chat.
Yeah. So the payment to publishers doesn't go through us. The payment to publishers. So actually, we maintain a fairly flexible model here, mostly in the early stages of the business. So this is question one. So the payment to publishers doesn't go through NYIAX. Ideally it does. That's more of a business challenge, right? We can support multiple. Actually, we do support multiple different payment processing flows, and so you've configured the system in such a way where we can kind of change that. But the challenge, obviously, with it not going through NYIAX is that it's tough for us to take a fee at some point. So we take a fee from the supply side, so from the publisher, and that's on the delivered amount, right? It's negotiated per publisher, and it's very difficult to get, not so much get payment, but organize the payment flows when you're essentially taking money from a publisher post delivery.
Right.
Experienced that a number of times. That's what frankly was one of the benefits of real-time bidding, because you have full optics into every single impression, and you know how much on every single impression you were supposed to be charging. So that model is a little more difficult there, but we do run through NYIAX as the primary model, but we also do support other models.
So, and is the business model, I mean, maybe this is an evolving discussion, but is the business model based on a transaction fee ultimately?
Yeah, ultimately. So ultimately, it's the transaction fee model. If you look at the kind of evolution of the business, and especially given what's happened in the business, the advertising business for particularly last 5 years, there's been obviously a lot of optics on who gets paid what, especially in the middle. Our goal is to reduce the supply path down as much as possible, right? In fact, that's part of the reason why we've done the partnerships we've done with companies, so we can reduce the cost right down. We ultimately believe that, same as Nasdaq, that the kind of transactional cost of delivering media should be, very, very low. We should be a very large business with very low transaction fees as a media and advertising business. We have to start somewhere, and we started with the model of a transaction fee to the publisher. We don't charge for currently on the buy side at all, although I think at some point in the future that will be reviewed and see depending on what value we're providing. So part of that is driven by the idea that like a clear, transparent fee model is exactly what the folks that are spending the money in the industry are asking for and deserve, because they've not had that for the last number of years. Yeah, so I'm just trying to think of the second. I think I've answered the third question last. Do you take a payment on both sides, advertiser and publisher? So no, just on the publisher side today. And then the second question was, how are the quality control vendors ensuring or validating the impression are served to the interested intended target decision trees, multiple plaintiffs served and different audiences? So So typically, in our model,
Mm.
we're taking a single count of record from a single vendor that both buyer and seller have agreed to, and we're taking the reporting from that vendor, and we can actually take multiple reporting signals from multiple vendors. There's always a single count of record, and that typically is only considering something like a viewability, although in the future we see that the rules of the methodology for that the buyer and seller agree to can be multifaceted. Today, with sense, the first our agency partners ask for is, can we do a combination of, as you say here, decision tree or multiple target creatives? Today we're not doing that, but absolutely we can do that in the future. So today, the short answer is it's a simple single source of truth capability. Now this is one of the reasons why this is a good question in the sense that we always saw that there were multiple models for blockchain usage. At the point in time where there is more clarity around people's identity on the web, and the clarity on what purpose an individual's data can be used for, as we kind of play out the next couple of years of GDPR and CCPA and a lot of the regulatory scrutiny that's coming down from governments, I think we've got a chance to actually fix the problem that you're referencing here. But until that's fixed, I think it's still using a little bit of combination of the older school technology with some new stuff here.
Is that the point you're making, Richard, is you'll be able to actually verify the target that was served?
Yes, today it's actually very difficult, mostly because there's not really authenticated user, there's not really permission to use the data, there's not really any way to securely see the transactions weren't being spoofed. Like, it's until that problem, that core internet advertising problem or just web problem is solved, I think we're not in the business of solving that problem. We're certainly paying attention to folks who are. And in fact, actually, is one of the main reasons why we ended up, York and I even ended up getting connected, because we both, I think, see that there's a path for that with using blockchain tech in the future. So we would like to interoperate with providers who are helping to solve that problem. And ultimately, I think we get to a point there where there's no real question about that audience being who they say they are, or it being spoofed by somebody in the middle. So I'm conscious of time. I'm happy to continue talking, but I could just make one last point about this slide, and that's actually the last one, if that's okay with you.
Go ahead.
Yeah. So I think the to kind of cut the longer story short here, the point is that we see that there's always going to need to be an interface with people, with machines inside the process, right? So every one of these steps, it needs to be a machine readable version, a human readable version, and ultimately an interface in order to do that with a manual process and an automated process. And you need to, the way we think about this is that every step of the way, we need human readable event streams and a variety of implementations to different blockchain providers in order to kind of allow for a slow transition over the next 5 to 10 years into a more automated system. But the foundation we've built by being able to interoperate with multiple blockchains, by having the contract, the thing following the money, right, following the rules, and ultimately what buyers and sellers are agreeing to in advance, is a really good stable base to automate from there, right? And this is the model that we see as being important. I think token exchanges could be good, one of the steps that we implore here. But that last point was really what I was trying to make. And
yeah. So you're upfront. You're calling it upfront and not a futures contract explicitly for a reason. Is that?
I mean, it depends a little bit on the audience. Honestly, I think the challenge with using very specific financial market terminology is that because there's not regulation and because there's not a governing, there's not the CFTC or the SEC scrutinizing the advertising industry, those words don't necessarily mean the same thing.
Right.
It would be true to say it was a futures contract in an advertising sense.
Mm-hmm.
True to say it was an upfront as well, although upfronts typically aren't done in the same systemized way. Mm. But it's the contract that's actually brokered between buyer and seller is actually the same paper.
In terms of thinking about the opportunity for better financial flows, have you thought about how NYIAX could play a role as an escrow agent?
Yeah, so I think so we don't talk about this much at the moment because it's a kind of a second step, if that makes sense. Mm-hmm. So we need a primary market, but ultimately there are some parts of the industry that take money, take capital, and deploy it in advance onto publishers, and say, okay, we were buying this amount of inventory from you in a future date with a certain discount, and so there's a bunch of different instruments that we can create off the back of that. So you think about, we could be an escrow agent, we could in theory, with a more stable data flow across our system, you could start to assess risk better. You could also create an insurance vehicle, right? Yeah. So you could insure against challenges you have with a pandemic that might come, as an example.
Presumably smaller publishers, right, are probably factoring some of those payments, right?
Right. And today there's a bunch of companies that do that. So there's FastPay, a few others, but they don't have any. What they don't have is they don't have a systematic way to capture and assess that information, right? So by bringing that data back into the exchange, buyers can start to look at comparing the things that you would not normally be able to compare, like how likely are they to actually meet their delivery target on time, or as a buyer, buyer assessing a publisher. Mm-hmm. Buyer could also take insurance out against them not doing that, right? Or even having to cancel. So yeah, there's a lot of, we do think about a lot of that, and there's the structures. There are a number of opportunities that we already have planned. We just need to take this. We're at a point now where we're growing the primary market, right? So that needs to be there first.
Yeah. Yeah. And so when you say sort of primary market, you're considering certain types, basically enough brand recognition, enough volume. Is that an accurate statement?
Yeah, I think the volume is the I think enough of a data set across various. So we didn't what we didn't do is we didn't say we're going to go after finance as a vertical, right? So we do that. We do have a set of pubs and a set of buyers that are pharmaceuticals or finance or so on and so forth. But what we did is we went a little bit more broad. Mm-hmm. So we focus a little bit more on the kind of typically direct sold or private marketplace type deals. Right. Sometimes some people associate us with automated guaranteed or media that's been guaranteed with a fixed price. So we focused on that, right, rather than doing. We need the scale we're talking about right now is the primary market is a little bit brand recognition, but probably more importantly is just a significant number of money flowing through the platform, and enough data for verification, enough data for delivery to be able to feed back and say this is typically what happens in this area of the web.
Mm-hmm. Got it. Okay. Well, that was wonderful. I just I stopped your sharing.
Yeah. Yeah. No worries. I'm starting to disappear here. Hold on, I'm trying to find a light. Bear with me a second. Oh, you might be able to see me a bit better. My head was disappearing.
Well, that was great. Anyone have any final thoughts before we let Richard get to his evening? Okay. Well, I'm ready for my snack break, so.
Yeah, well, thanks for having me on to this evening, York. I appreciate being able to share my story and the NYIAX story a little bit. I'm happy to be, if any of you have any follow-up questions, or please feel free to reach out. I'm always interested in hearing a younger perspective on our industry.
Great. Thank you so much, Richard.
Thank
All
you.
right. Stay safe, everyone. Bye for now.
Thank you. Thank you.
Bye.